Okay. So first of all, it's so good to see all of you. Thank you for being here. We have our regular ALI people and some followers of Rabbi K'vod who are with us today. Um, and I think some people will be joining us. Just want to say this is part two of a three-session series uh, that Rabbi Weeder is teaching us on Neo-Hasidism. I know you all know that. Those of us, I just want to just to compliment you, Kavod, on your first class was so compelling that there was actually chatter about it. You know, long after the class was over, which doesn't always happen. So you should feel really great about that. We all learned a lot, and it's been shared with some other people who have asked for it. So wanted you to know. Um, Next week, in case I forget to say at the end, Bex Rosenblatt is coming back on to teach a three-session course on different styles of governance in the Torah. And many of you have already seen that, but she's a master Bible teacher. And if you are here because of Kavod, but are interested in sort of expanding sort of your relationship with Jewish text, you would probably really enjoy learning with Bex as well. And some of our colleagues will be teaching us in the spring. Rabbi Uri Allen is going to be one of our scholars, and Rabbi Sarah Basson is going to be one of our scholars. We have some really exciting people coming up in the spring. So please get on the ALI list. If you're able to make a donation to support this program, we're so grateful. If not, we're still delighted that you're here. And without further ado, I'm turning this over to Kavod.
Good morning, everyone. Glad we're all here together. Again, this whole course that we're doing is titled Neo-Hasidism, a creative approach to making Jewish meditation and spirituality accessible. And really, it's trying to also understand on an intellectual perspective what's happening in our Jewish world, and how we find ourselves open to some of these opportunities. A couple weeks ago, our focus was more on the journey from Kabbalah and Hasidut to modern Neo-Hasidic practice, and we looked more at the history of things. And this today, we're going to look more at principles of Hasidism as it was first birthed in the 18th century, but then also Neo-Hasidism, and specifically at some of the luminaries of our, what we're now calling our Neo-Hasidic unfolding flowering. Before we start, though, we could not have any kind of real giving over about Hasidism or Neo-Hasidism without singing a nigun together, or a wordless melody, because melody and nigunim were such a crucial and important part of the whole Hasidic and Neo-Hasidic path of learning Torah, of prayer. It's really one has to a lot of our early Hasidic masters felt like the teaching and the melody went together. So this morning we'll do a Bratslav from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav and his whole lineage and disciples. We'll do a melody that is common at our Shabbos table, especially during hand washing before Kiddush and Motzi. And this is from a line called Oz V'Hadar. We won't sing the Hebrew, we'll just sing the melody, but that is part of the Eshet Chayil, Women of Valor piece from Proverbs that is traditional to say on Friday nights. And I want to really invite you, as I'm singing, as you start to hear the melody in your own space, in your own home, you're muted, it's all good. Feel free to sing along with me, and see if you can feel a little bit of the spirit of it in your heart. Diddy nai 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 and nai 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 nai. Diddy nai 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 I nai I nai. Diddy nai 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 and nan 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 nai. I la lai lai lai. Ya la 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 ya la lai lai lai. Ya la lai lai ya la lai lai lai. Ya la 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 ya la nai nai nai. One more time. Ya dai 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 ya la lai lai. I nai nai ya na nai ya na nai. I nai 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 ya na nai nai. I nai nai ya na nai ya na nai. Diddy nai 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 ya na 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 nai. Diddy nai 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 I nai I. Diddy nai 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 ya na 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 nai. I ya la lai lai I. Ya la 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 ya la lai lai lai. Ya la la ya la lai lai lai. Ya la 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 ya la lai ya. I'm gonna just do here in just a moment is just put a link in the chat to the source sheet that we will be using. I'd rather, if you can open it up in your chat, that's a better way to do it than I think of screen sharing it, because I'd like to make sure that we can see each other and hold on one moment. Okay. So hopefully everybody can open the piece that's in the chat. And what we're going to start today is with the innovator, the founder of what we would call what is most commonly known as Hasidism, which is the Baal Shem Tov. And we spent some time 2 weeks ago speaking more about the Baal Shem. You'll see just on your source sheet a few of the innovations of the Baal Shem. Was his trademark, and a very specific, significant part of his legacy to this day was how he read texts, bringing out new meanings and giving them new life. This surprising of the mind by a new reading of familiar sources served as a kind of awakening device, stimulating the hearer to a deeper sort of consciousness. Right, and in a moment we'll look there's other pieces here, other notes that you can look at. But I want to just go down a little bit further to the text there to see how the Baal Shem would awakening new meanings of the text. So his main disciple, Yaakov Yosef HaKohen of Polnoi, published a book called Toldot Yaakov Yosef in 1780. And this was really, all of it was really a book of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov never wrote down anything himself. It was all written down by his disciples. And Toldot Yaakov Yosef, this particular book, is one of the great repositories of the Baal Shem Tov's teaching. And if you look at the text here, he says on Parshat Vayechel, "This is a great thing that I learned from my teacher. In every human pain, whether physical or spiritual, they should pay attention that even in this path, God himself can be found. It is just that God, he is concealed in a garment of the pain. And when this is known, the garment is removed and the pain is nullified along with all harsh decrees." And he spoke about this at great length, and the words of the wise are so sweet. So right here, we're being able to see a little bit of a foundation of one of the principles of Hasidism, which is that everything is God. And you can see this in the next part of that source sheet. The key components of the Baal Shem Tov in early Hasidism is this sense of immanence, right? Immanence. Everything is God. There's no place devoid of God, which means that even in our own pain, Even in our own pain, God can be found. There is consciousness, there is life, there is meaning that is behind everything in life, including our pain. And again, as we spoke about 2 weeks ago, one of the great innovations of Hasidism was it took these very deep mystical Kabbalistic concepts and made it accessible to the normal folks, to the tevias and the water carriers and the milkmen, all of our ordinary folks, people who are like us, who are householders that aren't studying Torah full time, and instead being able to say one can awaken to God's presence in everything, right? Even in our own pain. So that's one of the main components of the Baal Shem Tov and early Hasidism. Another one is something called panentheism. Panentheism is this fancy word to say that God is both immanent and transcendent, which means immanent, that everything in the world, our own pain, our physicality, the creation, everything is, God is in and infuses and expresses God's self in everything. And at the same time, God is also beyond everything, not just the physical world, but even beyond that. So where some people might say that if you want to say that God is in everything, just the physical world, the immanent, but not the transcendent, the fancy word would be pantheism. But this is a little bit different, panentheism, that within and beyond. This is a key part of Hasidism. Mimale kol almin v'sovev kol almin. God fills all world and surrounds all world. Another key concept is tzimtzum, contraction. And in this kind of case, this is being drawn on a reformulated version of the Ari, or the Northern Sfat Kabbalah, that was in the 16th century, that basically said that a way of trying to describe the paradox between living in the presence of infinite divinity and at the same time experiencing ourselves as finite is that there is a whole Lurianic expression of creation in which at first God was just infinite. There was no place empty of God. But then for what some mysterious reason, whether it was a desire for relationship, God withdrew God's self, almost pulled God's self out of a center point so that there was a space in the universe where there was not God. There was an emptiness. And that process of withdrawal is called tzimtzum. And that was the only way that a finite world could be created, because how could a finite world exist in infinity? So that tzimtzum created that space, and all of our finite world with all of our creation and Big Bang and stars and all of this is completely created. And then God infuses God's self back into that finiteness, and everything shatters, everything breaks. And that breaking is a way of talking about the way that our world is broken, the way that human consciousness is fragmented, of seeing things as separate. And yet, in every bit of that brokenness, there are divine sparks. God's presence shooting into everything. There's these divine sparks. And so that's another whole piece, that really the first sense of tikkun olam, repairing the world, was actually this act of becoming aware of and redeeming these sparks. But for this idea of tzimtzum, of contraction, it is really a way of talking about that when we experience the separateness of the world, the brokenness of the world, there's an aspect of that separation that is largely an illusion. It's a lens that we as human beings view the world in. And it's as a result of that tzimtzum dynamic. Nitzotzot, that's the idea of those sparks that are found everywhere. Avodah b'simcha, joyous service of God. This is what we're here for from the Hasidic perspective. God created the world in order to derive pleasure from the devotion of human beings. So really, to be able to serve God, to be able to act in ways that affirm this presence and interconnection of all life and all beings, is what we're here to do. Kavanah, right? Having intention, all of life, including the fulfillment of our physical needs, is to become an avenue of devotion. And furthermore, the Besh believed that physical pleasure can become an act of worship and give rise to spiritual pleasure. It's all in having intention and presence. Pinimiut, inwardness, anything that we do in religious life, it's not just about the outward performance of rituals and prayers. It's about feeling the inner meaning inside it that was stressed in Hasidism. Devekut, attachment for God, the ultimate goal. All of life is about feeling connected and serving that divine presence. Tefillah, prayer. This is the essential for Hasidut, for Hasidic thought. This is the essential paradigm of the devotional experience. And all of life, this is really important, should be seen as an extension of the prayer experience, one that involves the entire self at all times. So really this place of being opening up and being of service, we set that formal time of prayer in order to do that. But the idea is that once we stop the prayer time, we are still in a mode of devotion and service. Midot, our human task is that of uplifting and transforming our physical and emotional selves to become ever more perfect vehicles for God's service. And then the tzaddik, very core principle of Hasidut, is that a person who lives in accord with these teachings may become a tzaddik, a channel for bringing that flow of divine blessing, not only to himself, but to those around him and ultimately to the entire world. So, and that is really seen very much in the classic structure, Hasidic structure of the Rebbe and the disciples, that one really needs a guide to be able to take this path. So that right there is going to be kind of, will kind of encapsulate a little bit of those classical principles of Hasidism before we really go into Neo-Hasidism, which is what was the dynamic of how this now got brought forth in the 20th century into a modern world that has a certain social consciousness, has a certain spiritual yearning, is operating within a post-Enlightenment period where even Judaism and religion and rationality and science is something that is very prominent. What is this who are these Neo-Hasidic leaders and what were their teachings? We're going to examine 4 today: Martin Buber, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, and Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. So before we kind of launch into that part, I want to just open this up if people have any questions or comments around these principles of Hasidism and this kind of foundational Jewish spirituality that we've been discussing so far. You can either unmute, you can raise your hand. Just want to make sure we're all together with where it's kind of come from before we move into this new age. Sylvia, did you have something there? You're just holding. Okay.
No, yeah, I have I don't know what kind of question this is. Could you explain something about the contraction and coming back together of the sparks? I've read about this before, but I don't really understand it. Could you like give
Yeah,
me the
so great. So
3 seconds?
very briefly. So this is, again, this is a idea in Lurianic Kabbalah. So 16th century northern Israel kind of renaissance of Jewish spirituality. This is where we get our whole Kabbalah Shabbat service and kind of Friday night going out into the fields. So Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, taught that he brought forth a creation myth. And the idea of this is, even though it's told in linear time, like first there was just the infinite, and then God withdrew God's self, and then this, and then this. That's right. There's a linear progression. It's really meant to be understood as, how do we understand creation today in this moment? how do we understand this dynamic of human consciousness where we can be present to the divine infinite and at the same time have this finite consciousness of separation where there's me and you and this and that. And essentially what he taught was that at one point God was just infinite. There was no place for finiteness, there was no world, there was no any of that. There was just godly light and presence. And then for whatever mysterious reason, God wanted relationship and withdrew God's self from a center point and created a halal panui, a vacated space where God was not. Okay, where God was not. And this is the way that the Kabbalists are trying to, where Rabbi Luria was trying to say, how is it that human consciousness cannot be aware of the presence of God? And so this way of talking about this withdrawing, this vacated space, is kind of a way to say, hey, there are lots of moments in our lives where we are not present to that life godly force. And then with that vacated space, God then suddenly allows a finite world to be created, right? And this is where we can think about, the Big Bang, this incredible, explosion of ever expanding infinite matter that becomes our universe. And suddenly finiteness arises in this space. And in that space, trees, people, stars, all of this. And God, of course, God being infinite, cannot stay in a place where they're allowing there to be a space where God is not. So God then inserts, almost if you pulled back God's presence to create the space, God then pushes it back in. But of course, all the finite vessels of trees and galaxies and people and all those things that was created are finite. They can't handle this influx of infinite divine life, so everything shatters. And with that shattering, we have a broken world filled with broken pieces of divine sparks in everything. So that is the Lurianic way to try to describe how is it that we have a world of brokenness and suffering and pain, and yet God being present in everything. Well, it's through that language of the divine sparks that are in everything that is what we're trying to become aware of and connect with. Okay, let's move on because we have some good stuff to cover here. Martin Buber, one of the first, really what I would say is first kind of Neo-Hasidic voices, born in Germany. And there's lots to say about Martin Buber, but I'm just gonna focus on his Hasidic connection, which is that when he was 26 years old, he became interested in Hasidism. And what he writes, this is how he kind of opened to this. He says, until one day I opened a little book entitled Sfa'at HaRivash. That's the Testament of the Baal Shem Tov. And the words flashed towards me, quote, he takes unto himself the quality of fervor. He arises from sleep with fervor, for he is hallowed and becomes another man and is worthy to create and become like the Holy One when God created God's world, end quote. And then Martin Buber continues and he says, it was then that, overpowered in an instant, I experienced the Hasidic soul, the primarily Jewish opened to me, flowering to a newly conscious expression in the darkness of exile. Man's being created in the image of God, I grasped as deed, as becoming, as task. And this primary Jewish reality was a primal human reality, the context of human religiosity. Judaism as religiosity, as piety, as Hasidut, open to me there. Right, so that's he writes in his book called My Way to Hasidism. He suddenly is touched with this Hasidic spirit of God being in everything. And he wrote these books that became very popular, The Tales of Rabbi Nachman, The Legend of the Baal Shem, Tales of the Hasidic Masters. And he emphasized ecstasy and connection available in every moment. But here's one of the things that makes it very Neo-Hasidism is his experience of this joy and connection happened independently of halakha, of Jewish law. He presented Hasidism without any commitment to halakha, to Jewish life, to Jewish practice. It was really about being inspired in everyday life, not necessarily having to have the rituals and the prayer structures and the pieces that one has to do to help one become inspired, but instead that opportunity to be present, and to be present in a very real way. And of course, we know that later on, for those of you who are familiar with Martin Buber's I and Thou sense about being able to be open to God's presence in relationship, in connection between two people, was a real extension of his opening to the divine in every moment, everything. Rabbi Marcia.
So thank you. I remember close to 20 years ago when I think Stephen Katz from Boston University was the 1 month scholar with CSP, and his expertise was Hasidut, although he did it only from an academic perspective. But I remember him saying that Buber's stories of Hasidut were different than others. That he had modified them. And I'm realizing now, did he modify them to remove the religiosity from them? I just remember him saying that there was something about the way Buber would write Hasidic stories that would have been different than very devout, pious people would write some of these stories. And to your knowledge, is that a piece of how he altered them a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think that was his main feature of altering it. I mean, in his stories too, you have Hasidic masters that are engaged in religious acts, of doing it, whether they're, davening with tefillin or something about matzah and Passover. So he's still teaching the stories within the context of religious Jewish life, but where his focus is more is instead of on the mitzvah that's being done, it's the consciousness behind the mitzvah.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you look at this source that I included in just the source sheet, and again, if you have come on late, just raise your hand for a moment if you have access. Sarah, okay, so if you come on late, you might not have had access to the source sheet. So I'm gonna put it in right one more time. Okay, so there it is one more time. You can click on this. And if you go down to where Martin Buber, he writes about hitlahavut, or it means enthusiasm or the inflaming, the ardor of ecstasy, right? This is a quality. It is the goblet of grace and the eternal key. Hitlahavut unlocks the meaning of life. Without it, even heaven has no meaning and no being. If a man has fulfilled the whole of the teaching and the commandments, but has not had the rapture and the inflaming, when he dies and passes beyond, paradise is open to him, but because he has not felt rapture in the world, he also does not feel it in paradise. Right? This is kind of Buber picking out this very core Hasidic idea that says it's all about the internal reality. It's all about the kavanah. If you don't have this kavanah of this passionate enthusiasm behind your teachings and your practices, it didn't really do, your teachings and practices didn't really do anything. Hit lahavut can appear at all places and at all times. Each hour is its footstool, and each deed its throne. Nothing can stand against it, nothing hold it down, nothing can defend itself against its might, which raises everything corporal to spirit. He who is in it is in holiness. He can speak idle words with his mouth, yet the teaching of God is in his heart at this hour. He can pray in a whisper, yet his heart cries out in his breast. He can sit in a community of men, yet he walks with God, mixing with the creatures, yet secluded from the world. Each thing and each deed is thus sanctified. Right? So really beautiful spirituality in every moment, this passion. That was Buber. Heschel, right? A lot of us are very familiar with Heschel, may not be as aware of Heschel's real roots in Hasidism. He's generally seen as an American Jewish religious thinker. When he arrived in America from Europe at 33 years old, the three major influences on his life were already in place. Which one was the Hasidic world of his childhood. He was a direct descendant of the early Hasidic master, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apt, which is in the early, 18th, 19th century texts. It also influenced the mostly Jewish intellectual community of Berlin, along with the disciplines that he studied at the university there, and the experience of living for 5 years in and finally being booted out of Nazi Germany, right? So he came to America with all of these things, and his Hasidic roots may be seen in the manifesting of his thought in 5 significant areas. And again, there's so much to say about Heschel, of course. We're just focusing on his Neo-Hasidism. One is that he maintains a sense of wonder about God who fills the universe, right? This is the key Hasidic response to the sense of divine presence everywhere in each moment. And so everybody that connects with Heschel's openness to wonder and in every moment is really connecting with that core Hasidic teaching. Number 2, his understanding that God's existence is not to be proven, but witnessed. Not to be proven, but witnessed. And all of his theology, when you start to look at Jewish theology and the way that different people tried to articulate a concept of God, Heschel doesn't get into a concept of God. He gets into the process of witnessing God and what it means to witness. Third thing, that the world is in need of great charismatic religious figures who can inspire and guide others. But Heschel insisted on authenticity, right? His focus, of course, as many of us are familiar with, was on the prophets, which he wrote a 2-volume set in 1962. This was one of the major ways that this need was expressed through the prophets. He also wrote a whole biography and teachings of the Kotzker Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotz, called A Passion for Truth. And also to say Heavenly Torah, which was also really elevating Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. Marcia, you got that one? Who was?
It wasn't Rabbi Eliezer, but it was. But I'll tell you in a second. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You're right.
yeah.
Heavenly
But
Torah.
but all of these pieces is this core idea in Hasidism of having a charismatic religious figure, but one that's not about power over, but one who is just like truly the Rebbe, who's truly inspiring people. Heschel really took that on himself as something that was important. The fourth thing, he focused on chesed, kindness, and simcha, joy. He saw his role as bringing Jews to Judaism by means of a kind and open-hearted teaching. He never berated Jews for not being observant, which he was, but instead he tried to show them the light and the beauty that he himself found in religious life. And then finally, the last piece was really, I think, summed up by the title of one of his fantastic magnum opus works, which is, the title was God in Search of Man. God in Search of Man, which, right, we usually flip it. You think about a person in search of God, but in this idea, God is concerned with and affected by human actions. That God cares about what we do. God creates each human in the divine image so that we may fulfill our role of partnership with God, so we may discover God's presence both within the world and our own souls and respond to it with heart, but primarily by deed. And God is waiting for this response. Really beautiful teaching of Heschel in his book. I can't highly recommend this book, God in Search of Man. So those were kind of his core Hasidic moments. And the section that I brought for us from the source in the source sheet is, this is a kind of a classic Heschel. To live as a Jew means to feel the soul in everything, in others and in our own existence. And this soul requires spiritual elevation. Everything that has within it the spirit of life longs for repair, like candle wicks waiting to be lit. So we wait for the action that has a slight bit of pure intention, a grain of refinement. The soul in us will not find satisfaction merely in physical fulfillment. In each of us flickers the longing for Shabbatness, for beauty, for serenity. Anyone who chains and represses these longings and allows the powers of the soul to disperse to no end not only contaminates himself, his self, but also contributes to the world's destruction. For the soul which degenerates is the mother of all sins and the source of all evil. And all the evil and afflictions such as hate, haughtiness, and jealousy stem from the spirit of human beings. Right? So he speaks on this level of soulfulness to uncover the soul in everything in ourselves and our inability to feel our own soulfulness. It's a strong language. Anyone who chains and represses these longings for connection, for soulfulness, this is where evil comes from in the world. Okay, so that's Heschel. I'm going to keep going here, and we'll have some time at the end to talk because there's a lot to cover. I want to give some good attention to our last two here as well. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, most of us know as a gifted musician, teacher, and storyteller. He was born into a great rabbinic family. He was raised in a traditional German Orthodox community, but he met the spiritually infused religious world of Hasidism in his youth. And he spoke frequently of the need to mobilize Hasidism's spiritual legacy to lift the hearts and minds of Israel out of the Holocaust's incomparable damage. On the eve of the Second World War, Shlomo and his brother Eli Chaim escaped to Brooklyn, and he learned in the Torah academies of Lakewood and Torah Badas. And in the late 1940s, he left the insular yeshiva world and he followed his brother to Chabad. And that's where he met Zalman Schachter, later to be Zalman Schachter Shlomi. And both of them at the Rebbe, this is the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, at his urging, began doing outreach on college campuses. Both originally hoped that Jews inspired by their teachings, melodies, and stories would journey to Crown Heights and devote themselves to traditional lives of observance in the Chabad world. And throughout the 50s, he continued traveling widely and his reputation grew, drawing him into the traditional folk scene. And as his fame and acceptance grew, he began drifting away from Chabad. The Orthodox insistence on strict gender separations and the prohibition against men's listening to the voices of women singing, he realized would drive a wedge between himself and those that he was trying to reach. And in 1966, Rebbe Shlomo was invited to participate in the Berkeley Folk Festival. And there in the Bay Area, he saw the countercultural world in all its beauty and complexity, youthful energy, rebellion, drug addiction, sexual liberation, spirituality, the quest to recover one's roots, deep distrust of authority, a longing for peace and universalism, and the fundamental belief that the world is broken and in need of repair. And he was deeply attracted to the soulfulness of many of the young people that he met in that world who were more open to his own sort of spirituality than many of the Jews of the yeshiva world of his upbringing. And he really just embraced all of this. He founded the House of Love and Prayer in San Francisco. And when that closed in 1977, many of its former members joined with other disciples of his in Israel and founded Moshav Me'or Modi'in in Modi'in. And Reb Shlomo, he never gave up his religious observance. He was always an Orthodox Jew. However, he was, when it came down to mechitza and all of these, because of all the situations he found himself in, he found ways around. It was really important to him that none of that became the barriers for people. He didn't focus on those things. And he also did not focus on the difference between Jews and non-Jews. He really extended out, and so many, at his funeral, there were so many street people, people from all different religions that came to his funeral because of ways that they were touched by him. Above all, Shlomo Carlebach is most widely remembered for his stirring and inspiring music, which blended folk traditions with innovative Hasidic styles, and understanding both the pedagogical value and the aesthetic power of song. He once explained, "I began to sing my songs, and in between one song and another, I realized that I could talk to people about Judaism because when they sing, their hearts are open." Most of us don't even realize that a lot of the melodies that we know and we sing were composed by Shlomo Carlebach. I can, V'ha'erenenu b'toratecha is just one of the thousands, hundreds of thousands. To give you a little taste of his Torah, this is from the Torah of the 9 months. Again, he never wrote anything down like the Baal Shem Tov. There were just people that wrote down things, and he is focused on this midrash, a classic midrash that says that when the infant is in the womb, there is an angel that holds a candle and allows that infant to see from one end of the universe to another. And when the infant is born, the angel touches them right here, which is that little indent that we have on the top of our lip, and we forget all of our knowledge. And essentially, our whole life is about our learning of Torah, is about recovering that knowledge that we knew in the womb. And this is what he teaches about it in the Torah of the 9 months. He says, "Where do you find the Torah of the individual? This is the Torah of the 9 months." Because I was always thinking, what is the baby learning during those 9 months? Basically, we were on Mount Sinai, and then we come back to this world, and we had to learn the words to the great light which we had on Mount Sinai. But what is it that we have to learn in the 9 months? The Torah of the 9 months is the Torah of what I have to do in this world. What is the shape of my soul? The shape of my soul is what I have to do in the world. So, in the 9 months when the Ribbono Shel Olam is forming the body, the Ribbono Shel Olam is also shaping my soul. Shaping my soul is what I have to do in this world, my shape, my spiritual shape. And I want to say something, a Gewalt, really great thing. Maybe before we were driven out from paradise, maybe there was no such thing as being an individual. Le'ovda u'leshomra, to serve and protect. We all had the same soul. Obviously, God did not want us to stay there. Like the Ishbitzer says, this is Rabbi Mordechai Lanier of Ishbitz, 19th century Hasidic master, very radical Torah. Reb Shlomo loved the Ishbitzer. Like the Ishbitzer says, if God wanted us to stay there, he would have made us stay there. I'm sure you remember that the Ishbitzer says that the Ribbono Shel Olam wanted us to make the golden calf, wanted us to make the golden calf. Otherwise, he would have made us stop. And why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu come in time? Here, Klal Yisrael, the people of Israel, are the holiest Jews, the Dor De'ah, the generation of knowledge. Why can't Moshe come down? Why can't they make this clear? So the Ishbitzer says one thing. Eventually, we would have made a golden calf, but we would have never been able to go back to our roots, to Eden. So the golden calf had to be made by the Jews of Har Sinai so they could learn how to go back, right? There was this idea that the whole temple, the Mishkan, that we spend most of Exodus learning how to build, the sacred space, was a tshuva, was a repentance or a return from that sin of the golden calf. It was almost as if saying, the people could not be able to live the reality that they experienced at the revelation at Mount Sinai. It was too much. It was too deep for them. They needed something concrete that they could connect into, something that was finite. And if the golden calf didn't happen, then there wouldn't have been the opportunity to build the Mishkan. And if we didn't have the Mishkan, we wouldn't have that way to go back to God. So this teaching, again, that we, if we can trace this back from this original teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that said, God is even in our pain, that we can find God even in our pain, through the Ishbitzer Rebbe, through Reb Shlomo, it's bringing the same kind of teaching that's saying not only do we have an individual Torah, an individual spiritual shape of our soul that we spend our lifetime learning what our purpose is as we're going forward, but also the mistakes that we make in our lives, the golden calves, if you will, are necessary parts of our learning in order to go back. It's how do we become aware of them and lift them up. Finally, we'll move to Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, and then we'll have a little time to discussion. There's a lot to cram in 1 hour here. So Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, or he's fondly known as Reb Zalman, he was born in Poland in 1924. He was raised in Vienna, and after passing through Belgium and France to escape the Nazis, Zalman's family moved to America in 1941. And in Antwerp, while he was fleeing from the Nazis, he was exposed to Chabad Hasidism, and he was drawn to it, just like Reb Shlomo. He said, I was drawn to the Lubavitch tradition, a form of Chabad, because of its promise that one could become adept enough to attain certain mystical experiences in this lifetime. I also like the nature of the relationship between the Rebbe and the individual Chassid. So in arriving in America, he enrolled in the Chabad Yeshiva in Brooklyn in the 1940s, and he started as a Chabad educator for small Orthodox communities. But he wanted to branch out, and with Reb Shlomo, they went on to the college campuses. And eventually he came to realize that classical Hasidism, even if in its somewhat forward-looking Chabad version, would not suffice to fuel a Jewish renewal, religious renewal in contemporary America. He was interested in how a Hasidic model could flourish in an American culture that valued democracy and egalitarianism. And he sought to develop ways of communicating the spiritual tools of the Hasidic leader to others in his circle, and more broadly to the contemporary American rabbinate. He would say that the American rabbi has more in common with a Hasidic rabbi than with an official Eastern European rabbi who is mostly focused on deciding matters of Jewish law. Is the chicken kosher? Is it not kosher? Whereas, and of course, the American rabbi is much more pastoral, much more there to be there, hopefully, for the souls and the spiritual growth of congregants. He broke with Chabad and established the first Jewish renewal community, which was called B'nai Or, which focused on using the spiritual tools of Hasidism for spiritual growth in an egalitarian setting. And this eventually turned into what became known as the Jewish Renewal Movement, run by what we now have as this umbrella organization called Aleph. And one of his core insights is, Reb Zalman, is that Judaism and Hasidism in particular has had a series of turnings or paradigm shifts throughout history. This was a big idea of Reb Zalman's called paradigm shift, and even one collection of his essays is called Paradigm Shift. This idea of a whole kind of new expansion in consciousness. So the first turning or paradigm shift in Hasidism was that the Mishnah tells us about the Hasidim Harishonim, the pious ones that were dedicated to inner development. And we know this group as the Essenes, which was the author of the Dead Sea Scrolls, those during the time of the Pharisees and the rabbis who they had their own kind of meditative, contemplative community away from everybody else and were really practicing a lot of these inner practices. Then the second turning, or the second paradigm shift, was two moments in the medieval period happening in different geographical places. There was the Chassidei Ashkenaz in Christian Germany and the Chassidei Sepharad in Muslim Egypt. The Hasidei Ashkenaz was led by the famous Kalonymus family of Kabbalists, practicing almost a monastic form of Hasidism. And Sepharad was led by the philosopher mystics of the Maimoni family, Maimonides, notably the Rambam Maimonides' son Avraham. And they forged a community of Hasidic contemplatives whose teachings and practices parallel those of the Muslim Sufis, whom they openly admired. The third turning or paradigm shift was what we've spent last session and this one talking about, which was what we know as Hasidism, which was with the birth of the Baal Shem Tov. And then finally, he puts this fourth turning, this Neo-Hasidism, as this new paradigm shift called the fourth turning. And this turning has all the common elements shared by the previous turnings of Hasidism, but then some more, right? The ones that are commonly shared by Hasidism, we've talked about before: tshuva, repentance, return; prophecy and direct spiritual experience; prayer; specific spiritual practices to elevate consciousness; guidance through a teacher or a rebbe; community, the importance of spiritual community to support each other; halakha, Jewish law, the way; and providence, this idea that there is divine purpose to our lives. So Neo-Hasidism had all these elements of Hasidism, but then he articulates three important other ones. And what I just will say about this is, in this, just to say a moment about halakha, about Jewish law, in this Neo-Hasidic vision, halakha is very much a part of the Neo-Hasidic vision. However, it's focused more on the Neo-Hasidic teachers of today, focus more on the aspect of halakha that literally translates as the walking, as holech, as how you walk, versus law, right? Law is about what you do, what you don't do. Whether, and Hebrew words for this could be mishpat, could be other things, but certainly not halakha. Halakha is the walking. And this way is saying that there are ways to be in the world. There are ways to do things that have wisdom and connection and can inspire us and can guide us. But the Neo-Hasidic approach to halakha says, how do we understand those ways within our contemporary moment in time that we're in now with our lives? So it's important to notice that in Jewish renewal and in Neo-Hasidism, there's no disregard for halakha at all. It's considered a very core part of all of teachings, but is a little more flexible, more flowing. It's as a Rabbi Gershon Winkler, or it may have been Reb Zalman. I think probably Reb Zalman even coined this term flexidoxy. Instead of orthodoxy, flexidoxy, which was his way of saying there still is an oxy part of this, but part of it is learning how to be flexible. So those are the things that share with Hasidism. But then he added these new pieces, and if you turn to the source, we'll read this piece together, and then we'll conclude there and have some questions. He says, in one form or another, these elements have always been present in every turning of Hasidism, and yet each turning always contributes something new interpretations, new teachings, new practices, and new ideas. And the following are some of the new ideas in which the fourth turning bases itself. So the first one is renewal. More than ever before, Hasidism needs to maintain an awareness of its own evolution, of which the various turnings are evidence, in the context of the greater evolution of spiritual traditions on the planet. As consciousness evolves over time and the world changes, traditions must reclaim their primary teleological impulse in order to adapt to the needs of the evolving consciousness. This process of unfolding within and adapting without we call renewal. Renewal itself is characterized by the struggle to marry the magisterium of Jewish tradition to a new reality map or paradigmatic understanding of the universe. On a small scale, renewal is happening continuously, but it's also the process that we witness on a larger scale in certain epochs or axial moments in history, like ours, when religions and religious forms are breaking down and slowly reorganizing and reforming over time. Right? So this, of course, this core idea of renewal is what we now kind of known as what's called the Jewish renewal movement. But what's really important is Reb Zalman always articulated that the Jewish renewal is not a denomination like Reform or Conservative or Orthodox. It is a process of that is always present in Judaism. Judaism is always renewing itself. But when we are conscious of that process and participating in that process, that's what we're calling Jewish renewal. The other piece Reb Zalman brought in this fourth turning is deep ecumenism. He writes, however, as we explore the deep structures of our own traditions, revealing the basic functionality beneath the specific wrappings, right? What's the purpose of the rituals that we're supposed to do? The wrappings is how we do it, but there's a basic functionality. What's the tool that that ritual is helping to address? He says providence, as well as our own evolutionary perspective, demands that we acknowledge a similar sacred purpose at work in these deep structures, that we learn how others use them for fulfillment of the greater purpose, and how others can aid us in understanding our own use of them. While dialogue and other religious traditions undoubtedly took place in our dialogue with other religious traditions undoubtedly took place in our past, it had not the legitimizing basis or support in the tradition and rarely could take place openly. Today, it is nevertheless embraced by many Jewish leaders, being seen as a salutary attempt to achieve a measure of understanding between religions, discerning similarities and differences through dialogue and close observation. However, the Chassid must go beyond such surface knowledge, seeking the spirit beneath the external forms and teachings, undertaking the more intrepid explorations of deep ecumenism, in which one learns about oneself through participatory engagement with another religion or tradition. Right? So Reb Zalman is embracing this connection between Judaism and Buddhism, that we see right now in this time. And there's not a fear of other traditions coming in and polluting our Jewish piece, but the acknowledge that other religious traditions have always informed the development of Judaism throughout history. And scholarship can point to many epochs throughout that. But now it's time for us openly to acknowledge that and realize that our own tradition and our own souls can grow so much through dialogue and learning from other religious traditions. And then finally, egalitarianism. As we embrace this larger organismic view, seeing Judaism as a contributor to the health of the planetary system, we must not, as we have already said, forget to support the health and diversity of the internal Jewish ecological system. So just because I edited this and put this forward, Reb Zalman's organismic view is really that every tradition and every people play a role in the healing and health of the planet, just like the organs, all the different organs in the body play a role in the health and healing of the body. So in this case, Judaism plays this vital role of our planet. He's applying the same thing within Judaism, that we have our own ecological organismic system. Judaism has for too long excluded women from the full participation in the religious life of the community, denied the basic rights of individuals who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered, and erected high walls to protect Judaism from so-called outsiders. Although there may have been many times in our history where the exclusion of these groups served to preserve a fragile social order or seemed less important amid greater concerns for health and safety, today their exclusion is untenable and acts like a cancer in the body of Judaism. If Judaism would be healed and give its most healthy functioning back to the planet, it must embrace all of these groups, and in doing so, it will find that much of its new vitality and creativity will come directly from them. Okay, lots of stuff there, lots to digest. So I know it is 10:30, but with Rabbi Marcia, do we have your permission to take maybe 10 more minutes for those who want to stay on and have some discussion?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So please, we had a lot of teachers, a lot of ideas. Anything that any questions people have, things that you'd like to hear a little bit more of, or comments, please raise your virtual hand or your actual hand and we'll open it up. Sarah.
Okay, so I think that you're missing the Chabad Rebbe's from your list of Neo-Hasidic. Like, surely they belong in there too, if only for their influence on everybody who kind of branched off and set the stage for renewal. But especially with Kiruv and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, like it just feels like, I guess I'm curious how you draw this distinction between modern Chabad and what Chabad has become, which you could almost call another branch of Neo-Hasidism. And in particular, is that distinction drawn more by beliefs and kind of the doxy part, like theology? Or is it drawn more by politics in terms of egalitarianism? I guess you could call that theology also, but that's what I'm struggling with, is the distinction, especially because when you look at Aleph and Renewal Judaism and you look at Chabad in American Judaism, as we've talked about many times, one is much bigger right now in its impact than the other, and maybe not the one that this group would be cheering for. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I really, it's great to bring it as a distinction. So first of all, it's really, I want to draw this distinction that that Chabad modern today is not under the label of Neo-Hasidism as we've been talking about it and defining it. It is absolutely under the banner of Hasidism, meaning that and Chabad, as we know, different from all of the other Hasidic groups, that ultra-Orthodox groups, because of their mission of outreach and the Rebbe and being able to, open up, is making Hasidism. For sure, Chabad is making Hasidism available for Amcha, for the wide world. The pieces, though, that make it Neo-Hasidism versus Hasidism is a lot of what I think Reb Zalman articulated in these last few pieces, which is being able to take these spiritual principles and opening up to kind of what is to our modern times and to kind of these certain principles of social consciousness. And they do actually move very much into theology, meaning that the Tanya, the core Chabad text, the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Shneur Zalman, direct descendant of the Baal Shem Tov. Tanya is an incredible work of early Hasidism. I mean, beautiful, amazing stuff of Kabbalah that's articulated very clearly, all of it. And it also has all kinds of comments about the nature of Jewish versus Gentile souls as being like this, right? Jewish being more elevated. It has things about men and women souls and kind of ontological ways in which men and women are different, and certain justifications for the current halakha that's in there. So all of these core pieces that were articulated in that time by the Alter Rebbe and the Tanya were very much the common accepted perspective of all of the rabbis of that time and the world in that time. There was nothing radical about what they were teaching. However, those teachings still are part and parcel of the Chabad theology and how that actually demonstrates itself as far as participation, all of that. So that's the place right there where it's Hasidism, not Neo-Hasidism. So it's really kind of that definition, and this word Neo-Hasidism, again, like who owns that word and who defines it? You know, these are, I think, the voices that have really spoken about, have started to coin this sense of Neo-Hasidism, have really been Reb Zalman, have been Rabbi Art Green, and a few others, but it's a term that is fairly new and is really specifically coined in a way to define this separation.
Does Reb Zalman, I guess, does Reb Zalman like lay out exactly what he rejects? Like, does he engage in kind of the rabbinic literature of saying like, this is no longer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and in fact, I would really, I mean, Reb Zalman's teachings and writings and everything are absolutely fascinating, because everything that he puts forward is deeply, you know, is deeply coming from this very deep thought and learning and articulation. He knows all the sources, you know, and kind of putting forward, but speaking very passionately about why not only does the world need this kind of Neo-Hasidism that we're speaking of, you know, today, but why it's actually so consistent with the unfolding of Judaism and Hasidism throughout time.
And I just want to add, Sarah, that one of the things that K'vod talked about in his previous class was how originally Hasidism became associated with Orthodoxy, because it was created when that was really the only way that people operated in some kind of Orthodox framework, but a recognition that in modern times here, like, there would have to be another alternative. So it was, I mean, it's what he said today too, but it was I encourage you watching his first class too.
Are you calling me out for skipping class?
Nope. I'm just saying, I encourage you to watch the class. That was great. Thank you. Great explanation.
Great question. I appreciate getting to talk about that. Any other questions, comments?
There was a lot here, and we will I will make sure that the source sheet is connected to the recording, which will be on our archival material. And the next time Rabbi Weider will be with us is 2 weeks from now. As I said to you, Bex Rosenblatt next week, and then the last two sessions in February. For those of you from Bethel who are joining us, welcome to this wonderful learning forum. I just also want to acknowledge Susan and Rhea and Edie, Jackie, Megan, some of the Sheila, Rosalie, some of Sylvia, our hardcore learners who have been on the journey with us, Sandra. So Eleanor, thank you for being here. I hope this was as interesting to you as it was to me. And we do have a really exciting scholar series coming up for the rest of the year. And if there are many opportunities to engage with Rabbi K'vod. Most importantly, he does a Tuesday meditation where there's always some great teaching. It is learning and meditation, 9 a.m. Pacific time. And
On Zoom.
Say that again, dear.
On Zoom.
On Zoom. And you can find the link to register for that, to get that Zoom, also on our website under under spirituality and our collective. So thank you, K'vod, for this. Thank you all for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week or 2 weeks from now.
Thank you, everybody.